Good morning, folks. If you guys don't know me, I'm Dr. Alex with the Wellness Way in Eau Claire, and we've got a big topic today covering mold toxicity. Let's get into it. All right, so with mold toxicity, large reason why I was selected to do this topic today is because it's actually something that I run a lot in my own practice, and it's a large growing health topic that's trending online. Now, before we dive too far down this rabbit hole, I do want to shift gears over to our docs to the left of me to talk about what today's giveaway is.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be back on the ADP desk here. Today I'll be on Instagram interacting with all you guys, and we have some good news as well. We have an Academy winner today. She is a mom of 3 homeschooled daughters. She's a registered dietitian with many years of clinical experience. She realized the foods she recommended weren't helping patients solve their own health conditions, and she was looking for a new way to help others solve theirs. So our Academy winner today is Nicole Roth. Congratulations. We also have other good news as well. Dr. Destiny here just graduated chiropractic school and is now officially a Wellness Way doctor.
Yeah.
So what are you working on today, Dr. Dest?
Today I will be on the ADP website, so I'm looking forward to interacting with all of you guys there. And Dr. Antonio, what are we giving away today?
Well, I'll be heading over on Facebook here, but it is November now, and we're not skipping Thanksgiving, but our herbal throat spray. This stuff literally tastes like Christmas and applies to some of the things that you're going to learn here today. But let's let Dr. Alex take it over and show you guys what's all about the mold.
Yeah. All right, so back to the whole mold topic. Again, large reason why I was doing this is because it kind of started with affecting me personally. And so actually my wife, who is a Wellness Way practitioner out in the Columbus, Ohio area, she was dealing with a lot of health problems pertaining to her hormones. Nobody could figure out what was wrong with her. And we ended up going down this rabbit hole of discovering that mold toxicity was playing a large role in affecting her health. And after kind of seeing a lot of that, I started to realize that this is probably not something that's only affecting us. It's probably affecting many people around us. And so that's where we became experts in this whole mold topic. Now, when you're looking at mold, there's 2 really good books that I usually recommend a lot of my patients read, or even doctors that I might be working with within the Wellness Way. The first one that you're seeing, that Break the Mold book, is actually by a naturopathic doctor named Dr. Jill Krista. And she's actually residing here in Wisconsin where she practices, and she's world renowned for mold. And so that's a really good book. It's very easy for people to read. It doesn't bog you down with too much medical jargon, so it's very understandable for the general audience. When you're looking at the other book, Toxic by Dr. Neil Nathan, he's an MD that's actually been around for over 3 decades in practice with working with people that are really hypersensitive individuals, especially people that deal with mold toxicity. Both are wonderful books for people that are looking for more information on this subject. Now, when you're looking at mold, essentially, according to the CDC, what they'll tell you is, it's a fungus and it will grow in many different places. You're going to find it in wallpapers, you'll find it in the drywall, you're going to find it in the HVAC system. You're basically going to find it anywhere that there's moisture that can accumulate. And I want to make a big point to say that it only takes about 24 to 48 hours for water to start transpiring into a mold issue, which is why when I have patients come in that tell me things like, well, doc, I don't think that I have a mold problem because I live in a brand new home. Well, it only takes, like I said, couple days in order for this water to transpire into a mold problem. So there could have been problems with the building of the home. There could have been problems with maybe something else happened after the fact where there was a water spillage, maybe the basement flooded, maybe a pipe burst in the wall. You just never know. And so again, there may be less history to the home if it's a brand new build, but again, it can still harbor mold. Now, when you're looking at how often mold can accumulate, OSHA actually predicts that about 1/4 of the buildings in the United States have at least undergone some degree of water damage since they've been built. And throughout these buildings, any places that are basically going to be a confined airspace where air is not able to circulate very well, so pretty much any encapsulated building, like a hospital, school, college housing, churches, hotels, you name it, these are all places that you're going to commonly find mold that, because of the airtight space. Now, 66% of those buildings that have undergone water damage have actually been observed to have mold or mycotoxins accumulate in those spaces. And so this is a very common problem as if you've done the math. And so again, why isn't other people talking about it? You know what I mean? And so a large reason, in my opinion, is just because a lot of people either don't know that they have it and they don't know how to look for it, or they just don't want to talk about it because this subject can be pretty complex. And the thing of it is with mold is it's been around for thousands of years, right? There's actually passages in the Bible that actually kind of gives a mold remediation rule set that you're supposed to follow if you were to come in contact with mold. And so this excerpt from Leviticus actually talked about in the land of Canaan, they had obviously mold problems there. And essentially what would happen is if there was mold accumulating, they were supposed to call the priest in, examine the area, evacuate everyone out of the home, and then they were supposed to lock up the home, come back 7 days later. If that defiling mold was still growing in the building, then they were to rip out all the plaster in the walls, anywhere that they found the mold, and then come back and reobserve. And after their remediation, if there was still mold growing in that home, then the home was considered a defiling home that needed to be torn down, the timbers, everything, just basically burn it to the ground. And then they were to take all that rubble and move it to a safe place outside of town where they could bury the remaining parts of that building. And so this has been a problem for a long time. And when you're looking at mold, you're going to find it in a lot of places that are more humid, obviously, because of the excess moisture in the air. You can find it near bodies of water like lakes, rivers, river bottoms. And the other big problem that we're having is that the building materials that they're using to build a lot of these homes now actually already are infested with mold. If you look at the material that makes up drywall, for example, in nature, it already does have a little bit of mold on it. And all you need to do is sprinkle a little bit of water on that and it can actually start growing again. And OSB wood's a common type of wood that they use in a lot of homes when they're building them. That can also harbor mold. And so another big problem besides having everything so airtight now is that the building materials themselves can actually harbor mold. And then the third biggest problem that we're seeing is the amount of EMF saturation that we're getting exposed to now as well. And so there is a doctor named Dr. Dietrich Kleinhardt of the Sophia Institute in Seattle who basically did this study where he had a petri dish of mold growing and he put a cell phone right next to it and monitored how much mycotoxins were being produced by this species of mold after it was getting exposed to this radiation coming off the cell phone. We call those EMFs. And what they noticed was that species of mold was producing up to 600 times more mycotoxins getting exposed to that radiation. And so, when you look at the realm of EMFs, if you look back to 100 years ago compared to now, we're getting exposed to a billion times more EMFs than we were 100 years ago. And so, again, everything is airtight. We got more EMFs than ever before, and a lot of the building materials already generally harbor mold. And so this is a large reason why this is becoming a growing epidemic. And it's not just in the US. I mean, this is worldwide. I see international patients that are having mold problems as well. Now, when you're looking at best ways to test for mold, one of the ones that I usually recommend my patients do is the one that you're seeing up on the screen here. It's called a dust test. It's actually by a company called Yes We Inspect, and they're nationally recognized for being like the top people for mold inspection. But they basically designed this test very similar to the technology behind an ERMI test, which used to be the standard in testing for mold until this one came out. And essentially what you do is you take a cloth and you go into every single home, every single room in the home, and you're collecting dust samples. And the reason why is because mold actually accumulates in dust. It actually feeds on dust to survive. And so it's funny when I talk to patients or doctors about it, because after a lot of people hear that, usually they feel like they got to go home and they got to dust down their home pretty thoroughly. But anyways, you send it off to the lab and you can actually see all the colonies of mold that it's accumulated in there. And if you get a really high score, then you know that there's probably a mold issue in your house. Now, The other thing that I like about the test is it actually looks at different types of mold and how they grow with the amount of moisture that they're getting exposed to. And so you have xerophilic species of mold that can grow pretty rapidly, and they like more of the dry areas. So a lot of times with patients, they might tell me things like, "Doc, when I get to the dry season, like fall and winter time, that's when a lot of my issues start to arise." Well, a lot of these mold species can actually be more active during these drier climates. And so that might give you a clue as to, what's going on with them. When you look at mesophilic mold, it likes to accumulate in more of the damp areas. And so that would be more of your spring and summer months. And then finally, when you're looking at hydrophilic mold, it's type of mold that typically is growing in an active water leak. So if somebody ever comes back with a lot of species of mold that are at that hydrophilic category, you probably have a strong indication that there is an active water leak in your home that needs to be further investigated. So that's another feature that I like about that test. Now, another thing that traditionally happens, especially with a lot of mold inspectors, is they like to do air sample testing. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people have an inspector come into a home when they're suspecting that there's a mold issue, and they do an air sample test, and then they tell them that everything's fine. They came back negative. Air sample tests are wildly inaccurate. And if a patient ever tells me that they did one, whether it was a $20 Home Depot test that they purchased, or if they had an inspector come and they told them it was negative, doesn't always tell me that they're out of the water yet. Biggest reasons why is because first, when you're looking at an air sample test, it's like a snapshot of what's circulating in your airspace. As you know, air is a fluid, right? So there's a lot of particles that are circulating around in the area. And what you grabbed 5 minutes prior very well could be very different 5 minutes after taking that air sample. The other problem is when you're looking at mold itself, the air sample test is designed really just to pick up mold spores. And there are these little mold fragments that can actually break off these mold spores, and they're very light when it comes to their molecular weight, so they can just remain permanently suspended in the air. And those things can also produce these mycotoxins, which we'll get into later, that are making people sick. And those are never going to get tested on an air sample test. Then finally, when you got the lab technician actually looking over the cassette, if there's any debris that's making it so that they can't view that slide, they might actually omit that slide during their evaluation process. And so there's a possibility that they might actually be skipping over vital information that's containing mold on these slides when they're examining them under the microscope. And so there's just a lot of flaws that happens when you're looking at ambient air testing. Now, other things that you got to be aware of with mold too. It's a fungus, and it likes to live in something called a biofilm. It's basically like this slimy layer that protects it. It's like an armor that it resides in, and it makes it very hard to get rid of. It makes it very versatile. And when people are seeing mold in homes, they're commonly either throwing bleach on it or they're just painting over it with this antifungal paint. And the problems with those two methods is it's not actually killing all of the mold. It might be killing some of it, but usually it comes back with a vengeance. And now it's becoming more of a super bug because it's becoming resistant to these things that you're trying to kill it with. And it's also spitting out more of these toxins that are making people sick. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that painting over mold does not work. Throwing bleach on mold, it does not work. And a large reason is because of this biofilm that it lives in. Now, when mold feels threatened in nature, it's not only producing more spores to colonize or fragments, it can also produce mycotoxins and other chemicals. And these are all things that can make people sick. Now, when you're looking at the mold spores, again, they're really just basically the mold's attempt to try and colonize more mold. That's a given. But when you're looking at these fragments, a lot of times what'll happen is if you bust apart mold, it can actually start spraying out all of these fragments. And a lot of times you might see this if you remodel your kitchen, right? And you don't know there's mold there. A lot of times what'll happen is that mold gets disrupted and it starts spraying out all these fragments. And I will have patients tell me, well, I just remodeled my bathroom, I just remodeled my kitchen, and now I'm having all these issues. That's usually a sign that there's possibly some mold exposure that's playing a role in this. When you're looking at the ratio between mold spores and fragments, it's 500 to 1. And 1 square inch of mold anywhere in a building can produce up to 1 million mold spores, which can turn into 500 million fragments of mold. And both of the mold spores and the mold fragments can produce mycotoxins. So what I'm trying to tell you is I'll have patients tell me, oh, it was just a little bit of mold. It's just a little bit of mold. Well, just a quarter-sized piece of mold could actually spray out a ton of mycotoxins in your airspace that can make you sick. Now, you guys keep seeing me talking about mycotoxins, right? So I should probably tell you guys what they are. When you're looking at mycotoxins, essentially what they are these toxins that mold produces when it feels threatened in nature. When you're looking at the World Health Organization, they'll tell you that mycotoxins, they're a class 1 carcinogen. I mean, they're not to be taken lightly. They're known to cause immune deficiency, they can cause cancer, they can cause autoimmune disease. I mean, they're very toxic to the human body if you were to inhale them. And some of the symptoms that go along with mycotoxin illness is what you're seeing up on the screen here. If it was a multiple choice test of, which of the following affects the body with mold, it's pretty much option D. It's all the above, as you can see. I mean, you got the ones that are highlighted in blue are the ones that really jump out at me, where if these patients are coming in with these types of symptoms, it's almost a sure case of mold. But you look at blurry, distorted vision and eye floaters, these mycotoxins can disrupt the optic nerve. So a lot of mold literate doctors out there that suspect patients might have mold will make them do a mold acuity test. And if they fail it, then they'll proceed forward with testing for mold. Other things too, it can mess with the vestibular cochlear nerve that's in your ear that has that perception of sound and balance. So a lot of patients might start having persistent ringing in the ears. They might feel very dizzy all of a sudden or uncoordinated and lose their balance. They can get heart arrhythmias because mold is usually very damaging to the kidneys. And so it can actually make people have frequent urination, which will deplete their minerals in their body like potassium. When you start having these electrolyte deficiencies, it will affect how your heart is pumping blood, and you might actually start having POTS syndrome, which is kind of a pathognomonic that I see with mold. You might start having other heart arrhythmias, like AFib, for example. Other things that you can see with mold, you can have severe anxiety. Usually people have kind of thoughts of impending doom when they've got mold in their body because it just creates such a large stress response on the body that they start pumping out a bunch of stress hormones in their body like cortisol, and that's kind of giving them the sense of being uneasy all the time. You can start developing severe allergies because, again, a lot of people don't know this, but when the kidneys get damaged, you're going to have a hard time eliminating something called histamine from the body. Now, histamine is something that gets deployed in response to an allergen. So if the kidneys get damaged, you're not going to be able to eliminate this histamine very well. So you start developing something called histamine intolerance. What that can do is it can start to cause really bad allergies to form. If anybody out there has ever heard of mast cell activation syndrome, it's basically their body's mast cells spraying out uncontrollably to the point where people are developing these hypersensitivities to pretty much everything under the sun. And so a lot of my mold patients will start developing really bad allergies to food, environmental things, and it will almost seem like they're just falling out of the sky for these patients. Other things that you can start seeing too is you can see frequent strep infections. You'll commonly see that with children. The reason why is because when you breathe in these mold spores, they can kill off a lot of the good bacteria that's actually in your mouth, and then it creates this imbalance between your good versus your bad bacteria, and that can leave you susceptible to having a strep overgrowth happen in the mouth. Other things that you might start seeing too is with a strep infection, there's actually this childhood autoimmune issue called PANDAS out there that you can see start to arise. And what it will do is it will cause like extreme OCD, more erratic behavior. And again, you'll see this more in children. So a lot of children that I see that suffer with mold toxicity, they might have these odd behaviors where they're hyperfixating on things. They have like OCD behavior, ADHD, they're not able to sit still in class, and it just seems like a switch flipped on them, and then all of a sudden their behavior changed. That could be a sign that they might have this PANDAS phenomena going on because of these reoccurring strep infections. And again, this is all a result of mold toxicity. Other things too, a lot of patients might have really extreme supplement intolerances where they come in, they tell me, doc, I've tried the littlest amount of supplements and it just sends my body into a tailspin. I don't tolerate supplements very well. Same thing with medications. If you're somebody that out there feels like you don't tolerate those very well, it could be a sign of mold toxicity. Another thing that's really interesting is because mold can clog up how your body eliminates these toxins or metabolize medications or supplements, it can actually elicit opposite reactions with some of these supplements or medications. So for example, I've seen patients come in where they take a anti-anxiety medication their doctor prescribed them, but now it's giving them more anxiety. That's something that you can actually see with mold. Pins and needles throughout the body, because these mycotoxins can get into the nervous system. So people might start having pins and needles and numbness and tingling throughout the body. That's pretty common. They can get dizziness, vertigo, and seizures. They can also have reoccurring yeast infections, because yeast is also a fungus, just like mold. So as this mold starts to colonize your body, it's just creating an open breeding ground for more fungus to arise in the system. You can get sick easily, because these mycotoxins are very immunosuppressive to the body, so you're more likely to get other infections. You can constantly see other co-infections arise of that as well. So you might not just have mold issues going on, you might also have yeast overgrowth, parasites, viruses, Lyme disease. You could start getting all these other infections, because the head of the snake that's kind of orchestrating these matters is the mold that's shutting down your immune system, so you're more likely to get all these other issues. You can also start having reactive hypoglycemia, where after you eat a meal, you can start watching your blood pressure, or your blood sugar, crash really rapidly. That's pretty common. You'll see people really sensitive to EMFs, obviously, or chemicals and fragments, because their toxic load is so high in their body that common harmful substances that the average person gets exposed to, like exhaust coming out of a vehicle or fragrances, may not bother them. But for somebody whose tank is completely full, if it starts overflowing, you're going to start seeing these symptoms start to exacerbate, and they might not be able to tolerate any more toxins coming into their body. And so then they're going to start having these hyper reactions to things like fragrances. So obviously I could go on and on and on, but you get the point. It causes a lot of issues in the body. Now, other things too. So who's most at risk for mycotoxin illness? People that have methylation issues. So it's just kind of a hot trend right now, but if you've ever heard of the MTHFR gene mutation, or COMT, MTR, these are all genetic genes that we all carry, but some people have mutations to these genes. In fact, they estimate about 40% of the population might have a mutation with one of these genes. And what they will basically do is they can actually make it so your body can't eliminate toxins very well. And again, there's a whole bunch of other processes that go on with methylation, but eliminating toxins is one of them. And so if you can't eliminate these toxins, you're going to start to accumulate more, and you're going to have an issue. There is also another genetic mutation with something called the HLA-DR gene, and we call this the mold gene. This affects about 1/4 of the population, but essentially it makes it so that your own immune system can't recognize these mycotoxins in the body. And so what might happen is these people go into a source of mold, and they don't have any issues right away, because their immune system doesn't sound the alarm to let them know that there's a problem. And so they spend more and more and more time in there, where the average person might sense that there's a problem, just get out right away. They'll stay in there much longer, to the point where it might, I don't want to say too late, but they're going to start having way worse outcomes, because they spent so much time accumulating those toxins. Women would be another one, because women usually have more fat tissue on their body to regulate their estrogens, and you need fat in order to store toxins in the body. And so it just makes it a lot easier to store these toxins in the body versus their male counterparts. Other things too, people that have heavy metals in the body, like mercury amalgam fillings, for example. A lot of different critters in the body, like parasites, fungus, which is mold, they like to create that biofilm that we talked about, and they'll use heavy metals to construct that biofilm. And so people that have a lot of heavy metals in their body can make it very hard to eliminate mold from the body, or it can create a perfect breeding ground for more mold to arise. Certain medications like immunosuppressants, there are certain ones out there that are actually derived from mycotoxins. So if you take them for a long period of time, it can actually make it so that you start getting mycotoxin illness. So one particular medication I'll tell you about is anybody that's ever had an organ transplant, they will give you some type of immunosuppressive medication so that your body doesn't reject that organ. A lot of those particular immunosuppressants are derived from mycotoxins. Another thing too, breast implants. So breast implant illness is a very real problem, and it's not just because they can commonly get moldy. I mean, they can have heavy metals in them. It's a foreign substance in the body, so the immune system recognizes that it doesn't belong there. So I can't tell you how many female patients I've had come into my office where maybe we don't have a conclusive idea as to where this mold is coming from, but then you find out that they have breast implants. And then as soon as they get those breast implants removed, a lot of their chronic health issues go away. I've got story after story with those types of scenarios happening. So that's a common one. other places too. So buildings that are more common, or sorry, jobs that are more common to get exposed to mold. So military personnel, obviously mold remediators, carpenters, constantly remediating when they go into buildings to, maybe remodel a kitchen. Other types of individuals like college students, because of college housing, that's a common population that I see mold pop up in. Mechanics, I mean, some of those more trades jobs, you're gonna see it. Farmers, like old barns, these are all places I commonly see. So sometimes it's nice to at least get to know what the profession is that these patients are in, because if they're more common to get exposed to mold, it might make me want to go down that rabbit hole with them. And then lastly, the humid climate. So I see patients from all across the US, but I'll tell you that Florida, California, Texas, if I see that they're having headaches, migraines, dizziness, skin rashes, gut issues, hormonal imbalances, and I'm seeing they're in like one of these 3 states, yeah, we got to start testing them for mycotoxins because it's so humid down there. And some of them are right on the coast. And so there's just a lot of moisture circulating around. Now, is there a way to test for mycotoxins? Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the best ways is there's multiple labs that do it, but there's a urine mycotoxin test where you essentially pee in a cup and then they will measure mycotoxins in your urine. And if anything comes back high, as you're seeing on the screen, then at some point in time you've been exposed to toxic mold. And so this is a patient that I was seeing not too long ago, actually, and it was actually in her condo, and she was living in Chicago. And she was very sad because it was a very prestigious condo that she had in Chicago. She go overlook the lake, but it was just filthy with mold. And as you can see, these mycotoxins, they're not all the same. They're very different. So when you're looking at the biodiversity of mycotoxins, as you can see on this slide, they're all different in size and shape, right? They do different things in the body. And so sometimes patients might ask, well, I know I was exposed to mold. Do I really need to test myself for it? And if you want the best results, I would always say yes, because you don't know what type of mycotoxin you're dealing with until you've actually been tested for it. And each one's very different for how you eliminate it from the body. Now, other questions I'll commonly get too. So sometimes patients will say, well, my current home is a brand new build, but the prior home that I was in was dealing with a lot of mold. And so could this still bother me even though I'm no longer in the source? And the answer is a resounding yes. And so one of the phenomena out there is you can actually become colonized for mold, where if you inhale enough of these mold spores, they can actually start to colonize in your body and carry your problems with you place to place. This test that you're seeing up here is actually a good test. It's another urine test that can evaluate if these patients are colonized for mold, but they don't just have a bunch of mycotoxins accumulating in their body. They've actually got a live, active species of mold growing inside their body. That can happen. I actually had a patient who I was seeing down in Florida. He's in his mid-30s now, and he was having issues with a wide range of problems. His main one is that he couldn't get his wife pregnant. And he found out that he got exposed to mold like 20 years ago in his parents' home when the basement flooded. That's when a lot of his issues started. He just wasn't able to see any doctor that was willing to trace it back to that incident. And so for 2 decades, he's walking around with no answers. No doctor can figure out what's wrong with him. And then I tested him for mold. And as soon as we started, going after the mold in his body, he was able to finally get his wife pregnant. And his blood work that used to have like a page length of markers that were out of range were now starting to finally go back into the normal range. So it made a huge turnaround. So again, doesn't matter. It could also be a past exposure for some of these patients because of this phenomena with getting colonized for mold. Now, another problem that we're seeing is just agriculture. So there is food in America that can notoriously get moldy. In fact, most studies that you find when you go online are not human studies, right? Because it's a problem to intentionally put somebody under a toxic exposure, right? So you're not going to see a ton of human trials when it comes to mold. You have more animal studies. And a lot of farmers have studied this for a very long time. When they're looking at their feed that they give animals, they notice that it gets moldy and then it can actually affect the animal's health. Unfortunately, in America right now, there's not a lot of regulations in agriculture like other countries that really put the hammer down with evaluating whether or not the food that we're eating is contaminated with mold. In fact, countries like China will ship their food over here that they know is probably contaminated with mold because there's no regulations in America, and we'll just buy it from them and then we'll feed it to the general population. And so when you're looking at these 8 foods right here, these are foods that all commonly get moldy. And when I have patients coming in with mold toxicity, one of the first things I'm going to have them do is go on a mold-free diet. In fact, to have a really good sample of their urine mycotoxin test, it is always good to recommend to avoid these 8 foods for at least 72 hours before you collect that mold test, because then let's say patients are trying to get out of a lease, right? A lot of times if they test positive for mold and they show it to their landlord and they're trying to get out of a lease, they might tell them that it's just coming from food. A lot of patients get invalidated by their MDs too. If they ever bring a urine mycotoxin test to them to ask them to evaluate it, they'll just tell them it's coming from food. Well, that's pretty misleading because again, a lot of homes can harbor mold in them. So it's always nice to avoid these foods for a few days before you actually do that test. But while we're trying to help these patients heal from mold toxicity, avoiding these foods like the plague can really start to help them heal rapidly, especially with grains. I really don't have anything good to say about grains. I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, especially if you got mold issues. Coffee's a big one. There are companies out there that make mold toxin-free coffee though, and so there are some options out there. When you're looking at nuts and seeds, peanuts and pistachio nuts are the worst. And so a lot of patients, when I run like food allergy tests on them that have mold, they'll usually have a lot of nuts and seeds pop up on their list, especially these two. Peanuts is by far the worst though. So like peanut butter, I know a lot of people like it out there, but they've actually done epidemiological studies looking at Australians where they were feeding a lot of their population peanuts and they were starting to have really high rates of liver cancer because one of the mycotoxin that's commonly found in peanuts is called aflatoxin. And that's actually been shown to cause liver cancer. So no bueno. Doesn't matter if it's organic or not, you would want peanut that would actually be third-party tested for mold before you would consume it. And if you can't find it, it's probably not best to eat it. When you're looking at meat and dairy, again, if we know grains commonly get moldy and we're feeding our livestock grains, what do you think is going to wind up in the milk? Probably mycotoxins, right? What do you think is going to wind up in the meat? Probably mycotoxins. So this is a large reason why it's important if you're going to be eating meat and dairy to make sure that it's all grass-fed. I mean, that is what naturally a lot of these ruminant animals are supposed to consume anyways, like cows. And so that's another large reason why getting 100% grass-fed everything is always going to be really good. When you're looking at dried fruit, you'll commonly find mold in dates, figs. I mean, I love eating dates personally, but I'm allergic to mold and I have to be very careful with it because I've opened up a couple where I've seen mold in there, and as soon as I eat it, I can get flushing of the skin, you can get digestion issues. It's not a good day. And so you got to be careful with the dried fruit. It's best to eat more of the fresh fruit. Other things too, chocolate. I know this kills a lot of the ladies out there hearing this. There are companies out there that make chocolate that's mycotoxin free. There's not a lot, but they do exist. Otherwise, it's best to buy your chocolate from other countries. So like France or Switzerland, again, their agricultural standards are a lot different than America. So if you can buy chocolate that comes from these regions, then you're probably going to have a much higher likelihood of not being exposed to mycotoxins. Beer and wine's another big one too. So aside from mold, yeast can also produce mycotoxins too. And so again, brewer's yeast is a very common component that's added into things like beer and wine. And so if somebody's got these issues going on, it's best to avoid that stuff, especially with the fact that alcohol gets broken down like pure sugar in the body. And the number one thing that fungus likes to thrive on is sugar. I always tell patients this analogy is like, if you got all this fungus in your body, every time you consume sugar, it's like bringing cocaine to a party. And nothing usually good happens at those parties, right? There's holes getting punched in the drywall, the cops are showing up, it's not a good thing. So the best thing you can do is start cutting out a lot of your sugar intake when you got a fungal problem. And it will make people crave sugar whether they like it or not, because again, it wants to survive in the body. Then finally, your teas and spices. So it's best to buy them organic from a reputable source and not buy them in bulk. Because when you buy them in bulk, I mean, they're more likely to just sit on the shelf longer and breed these mycotoxins. So again, these are the foods that I commonly see that are going to get moldy. Now, what are your options if you do know that there is mold in your home? So back in the day, there was always just move and remediate. And that is why a lot of practitioners avoid this topic of mold. Lately, though, there has been a third option that I've seen good success with, which I'll get into in a little bit, but it's basically the installation of a very specific air filtration unit, and then there's some additional cleaning practices that have to be enacted throughout the home. But let's talk about what it would look like if you found a solid mold remediator first, because there is a strong litmus test that need to be followed if you're going to go the remediation route. So number one, make sure that the mold remediator does not also do the inspection. That's too much of a conflict of interest. In fact, in certain states, it's illegal to do both. The second thing I would do is kind of quiz them, ask them if they can explain to you what an ERMI test is or what mycotoxins are, what they do in the body. I mean, if they can't give you a real solid, concrete answer, then they probably don't have a really strong knowledge surrounding this topic. Other things too, ask them if they've dealt with very sensitive individuals before, people with mast cell activation syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, other ones too, like Lyme. I mean, these patients are hypersensitive individuals already, and if these mold remediators have never worked with clients like this, that can actually start to hurt the morale of the relationship between the remediator and the client. Other things too, ask for their certifications. I know that one's pretty obvious, but I mean, I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of, like maybe a landlord does the remediation project themselves. So they call Joe Schmo who shows up in a pickup truck and just starts splashing bleach on the wall, right? You got to make sure that these people are certified and they know what they're doing. Other things too is make sure that the mold remediator is also requiring an inspection summary. So a lot of times what's supposed to happen is you call the inspectors first, they go in, they find the mold, they write up this prescription on how this remediation needs to be carried out, and then you take it to the remediator, and then they carry out the remediation. And then obviously they call the inspector to come back in and test. I mean, that is how it's supposed to look in a perfect world. I would also ask these remediators if they know what a complete home cleanse is, because what that entails is you basically get these HEPA grade vacuums and you go through and clean up all the debris that's on the floor after you're done remediating. I can't tell you how many stories I've also heard where maybe they do rip out the drywall and they do this huge remediation project, but then they don't do a really solid cleanup after. So all these mold fragments are just sitting on the floor now, producing mycotoxins. So after the remediation's done, they got to wipe down everything, dust it down, HEPA grade, vacuum everything down. It's got to be done. When you're killing off the mold, they're supposed to use something called negative air pressure. So when you're evaluating for a local mold remediator, ask them what their methods are for how they remove the mold. Bleach is not an acceptable answer, right? You would want negative air pressure. Other things too, ask them the type of PPI that they wear, right? What protective gear are they putting on? Because if they're showing up in anything less than a hazmat suit, they're probably not taking their job very seriously. I mean, these mycotoxins can get absorbed through the skin too, and not just the way you breathe them in. And so they got to be covering everything up from the top bottom. Otherwise, there's a good chance that they might not be taking their job very seriously. I mean, think about it. If you know that these mycotoxins are a class 1 carcinogen, and they're just going into all of these buildings and they don't have any protective gear on, it puzzles me. I mean, if that was your full-time job, I mean, you're getting exposed to a lot of mycotoxins every single day for a career. I mean, that's just not a career I would want to do. Other things too, if a remediator ever suggests, we could remove this from the project, we could remove this from the project, basically telling the patient that some of the things that the mold inspector recommended that they could omit from the project, those are the types of people that you'd probably want to walk away from. Again, you should hold yourself to a very high standard of care. You're deserving of that. And so if they are suggesting, removing things that need to be done, it's probably best to go find a different remediator. Now, when you're looking for an inspector, there's a few other things that you need to evaluate. So the first thing is a visual inspection of mold is not an acceptable answer. I bring that up because, when people buy new homes, generally there's going to be some general home inspection that happens before they hand over the keys. And their mold inspection that they do is just a visual inspection. I mean, that doesn't tell me a whole lot of things. 95% of my patients that deal with mold toxicity never actually see the mold. So that's another problem too, right? I'll ask patients, have you ever been exposed to any water damaged buildings where there might have been mold present? And they might just stare at me like a deer in the headlights, right? Because they're thinking of like black mold growing right on the wall in front of them. 95% of the time, that's not the case. It's usually behind the drywall, it's in the HVAC system, it's underneath the carpet. And so a visual inspection is not good enough. You need to go a step further, and you should have a camera that's doing moisture mapping, detecting different temperature changes in the walls. You should be doing dust sample collecting. There is a time and place to do air sample testing, but you should ideally be doing all three. That is what a solid inspector should be utilizing in their toolbox. Then other things too is they should be willing to drill holes in wall cavities that they suspect has mold in them. So one thing that I like about the We Inspect company is that when they're doing their moisture mapping, if they see that there's a gigantic drop in temperature behind the wall, there's a probably clear indication that there might be some water behind that wall. And they might drill a small hole in that drywall, and then they'll take an air sample from the wall. That's a much more accurate way to actually evaluate mold, because they actually did a year-long study with those air sample tests where they drilled a hole in the wall. They put the air sample test right next to the hole that they drilled, and then 3 feet away from the wall, they put another air sample test. And they did that for 8 months in all these homes that they were seeing. And what they were finding was the majority of these air sample tests that were 3 feet away from the hole that they drilled came back negative. Obviously, the ones that were right next to the wall, they came back positive. So there's a time and place for them, but that's just to show how wildly inaccurate air sample tests are. But anyways, other things you want to ask to make sure that these people have the credentials to be mold inspectors. Again, you don't want just the random person coming in, eyeballing it. You got to make sure that these people are certified to do what they're doing. Then finally, the PPI. So you don't want the guy showing up with a polo shirt on, cargo shorts, and a clipboard looking for mold in the house. If they take their job seriously, they should have the proper PPI gear on, because they know how dangerous these things are for your health. Now, if you're looking at more of this Band-Aid solution that I mentioned earlier about this air filtration unit, the Wellness Way company is partnered with an air filtration company called My Triad Air. And what makes this unit so unique is that it can cover an entire home. In particular, this unit that you're seeing up on the screen here, it's called the V3 unit. And it has 4 different technologies in it for how it can clean the air. So the first one is advanced photocatalytic oxidation. Now, essentially what that does is it pumps out these hydroxyl radicals that can go around in the air and break down, air pollutants like mycotoxins, mold, viruses, bacteria, etc. Second feature on it, this negative ionization, what it does is whenever there's pollution in the air, whether it's even EMFs, chemicals from off-gassing of paints, viruses, bacteria, mold, mycotoxins, a lot of times they produce these positive ions into the air that are going to be harmful for your health. This negative ionization brings out these negative ions that basically bind to the positive ion, and it creates this molecular weight to them so that they can't sit in the air anymore and they just fall to the ground. So it takes it out of your breathing space. So a lot of times I suggest patients, because of this concept, after installing this unit in their home, after about 2 weeks, they should probably do a deep cleanse of the home, because a lot of times they're going to notice that a lot of the surfaces around their home get dusty afterwards. Yeah, it's because it's taking a lot of those particles out of your breathing space and it's fallen to the ground. And the third option, or third feature on this unit, is that it has ion antenna. So what this does is it has a pulsed vibration to it, and it basically orchestrates how these other cleaning molecules are, exiting the unit. And so what's nice about the Triad Air unit is it's more of a proactive unit and versus a reactive unit. And so when you look at a HEPA grade filter, which unfortunately has been the #1 recommended air filter for mold, it just sits there and it's more reactive. It's just pulling in all the air particles around it to filter. And there's a couple problems with that. Number one, the HEPA grade filter doesn't filter out mycotoxins, right? Because those fragments that produce them can remain permanently suspended in the air. And when they come in contact with the unit, it just passes right through the filter. It's kind of like the concept out there with the whole COVID thing. When people were putting on masks, those particles are so tiny, it just goes right through the mask. It's the same concept. So HEPA filters are not good at protecting you against mycotoxins. They can do some help with mold spores because they're big enough, but it's not getting the full picture. And again, it's not going around to the entire house. With the Triad Air unit, it's actually proactive, so it's going out throughout the entire house. And so it's leaving the unit and it's going upstairs, it's going downstairs, it's going through the ductwork. It can cover an entire home, which makes it a lot more valuable. And then finally, it has an ozone feature on it so that it can sterilize any type of microbes that don't belong in your breathing space. Now, a lot of people are skeptical about ozone because they read that ozone can be harmful to the lungs. There is some truth to that. The problem is with those studies is that the amount of ozone that people are getting exposed to is way higher than what this thing is producing. And so it can cause some damage to the lungs. What's nice about the Triad Air unit is you can actually adjust how much ozone is coming out of the machine, number one. And number two, the amount of ozone that's coming out of that machine is mimicking what's outside in nature. I mean, ozone is found everywhere. That's the reason why mold doesn't make people sick when they're going outside, is because there's naturally occurring ozone outside at all times that's sterilizing your air. You know, if you've ever been outside after a rainstorm and there's that distinct smell in the air, that's ozone that's evaporating off the surfaces. And so the idea behind the Triad Air units is really just mimicking nature. Now, there's a couple other things I want to talk about when you're looking at cleaning a home from mold. And so this is mainly for my hypersensitive individuals. But when you're looking at cleaning the mold out of the home, not just installing the unit's important, you also need to dust down everything in the house. Again, mold accumulates in dust. And so you need to do a thorough wipe down of all the dust that's in your home if you're going to do this Band-Aid solution. Other things too is you can't throw bleach on the mold. If you see it, use hydrogen peroxide or distilled vinegar. Other things too, if you can, keep the windows open, right? You want to circulate that fresh air in the home. Obviously out here in Wisconsin, it's starting to get cold out, so people are going to keep the windows shut longer. So I've been having these conversations with a lot of my mold patients, telling them, hey, if you can't move right now, or you can't remediate it, this is now the perfect time to get a good Christmas gift this year, which is your Triad Air unit, to start cleaning your home if you can't keep those windows open. Other things too is there are certain diffusers that I recommend people install that carry certain essential oils, like holy basil is my personal favorite. It's antifungal. It's very calming on the adrenals. I would put a lot of those throughout the house so you can also clean your air that way. Avoid the foods that commonly get moldy. Once you've done all these cleaning practices, if you want to go even further, getting a HEPA grade vacuum to clean up the floors would be good. And then finally, there is a company, and I don't make any commission from them by any means, but I just suggest them because I've seen good results with them. There's a company out there, if you go to oralroots.com, the brand is Oasis. It's got this fogging machine of certain essential oils, and every few months or so, you can go through every crevice of the home and fog down the home, and that can keep a lot of this mold at bay. Now, the other thing is it's always recommended to clean your personal belongings, okay? So mold is not always just in the air, right? It falls eventually due to the laws of gravity and can wind up in a lot of your items. And so this is probably the most overwhelming thing that can happen with patients, but it's always recommended that after a while you start eliminating anything that's porous material, because a lot of these mycotoxins can harbor in them. And so things that are like made out of wood, like wooden desks, for example, chairs, fabrics, etc. You can salvage your clothes. You can wash them in distilled vinegar and keep your clothes, but you know, like anything that's like made out of wood, unless it's sentimental, you very well may want to consider eventually getting rid of that. I'm personally allergic to mold, and I can tell you that I've actually sat at some desks before and had skin rashes start flaring up on me after knowing that it was in an active source of mold. I had a lady in Washington that I was working with who sold all of her belongings except for this one office chair that was her favorite chair. So she kept it, and after she sat down in that chair, she flared up in eczema everywhere. And so it is something that's worth talking about for sure. If you're feeling overwhelmed, I understand. I always recommend to patients to prioritize these things, starting with your bed, right? You spend a quarter of your life sleeping, and so it would always make the most sense to probably change out the bed first. Other things that you should do is control the humidity in the home, right? And so any humidity that's above 50% can actually start creating a perfect breeding ground for mold to accumulate in the home. And this could be a big problem too, not only for the humid climates, but you know, for places like finished basements, for example. I know Dr. Jill Christus said that some of the mold inspectors that she worked with in her area said that the majority of homes that have finished basements have mold in them because of the humidity that can start to accumulate down there, because you're never giving the basement an opportunity to breathe. And so getting a dehumidifier and getting a hygrometer to measure the amount of humidity that's coming out in the home, that's always a really good way to keep mold at bay in your home. Now, from a clinical standpoint, when you're working with me or any other type of doctor in the wellness way, obviously there's an art to it, and so they're not always going to be the same, but this is kind of something that I have seen really good results with, that I do, and a few other doctors that I've taught on this method. But this trifecta of labs are usually what I will start patients out on when I suspect that they have mold toxicity. And the reason why is because, the general concept of what we do at the Wellness Way is we believe all disease in the body comes from inflammation, right? So it's always nice to have a nice layout on the table, first and foremost, to see what's stressing out the body, so we can start working on removing these stressors so that the body can heal itself. And so first off, I want to know, do you have mold toxicity, right? So the mycotoxin test is pretty self-explanatory. Now, because mold can get into the gut, it can create something called intestinal permeability. We call this leaky gut, where you start developing a lot of food allergies. And like I was saying earlier, people usually have this mast cell activation syndrome that can start to happen with mold. And so a lot of times you see people have a ton of food allergies wind up on their list. And I'll have patients tell me too, they'll be like, "Doc, I am so sensitive to so many foods, I don't know what I can eat." So that's always another really good one that I run on patients. The third one is a stool test, because again, most of the immune system responds in the gut, and the primary way that you actually eliminate mold from the body is actually through your stool. And so on the stool test, I want to see, how is your detox pathways working right now? I want to see if somebody's dealing with really bad constipation, which is a common symptom of mold. I want to find out why they're having that constipation. And I also want to look at the co-infections. And so I want to see, do they have candida overgrowth, which is yeast? Do they have parasites? Do they have bacteria? I basically want to see what that collateral damage looks like outside of the mold. What's interesting about all three of these labs that you're seeing up on the screen here, these are all different patients that were suffering with mold, but I didn't test them until way later in their care because I didn't know that they had mold toxicity. And so obviously I don't practice that same way now. That's why they call it a practice, because you're always forever learning. But these three patients, they're obviously seeing way different changes in their healthcare. I just wish we could have helped them a lot sooner. Now, every time we do an ADP, we always have a supplement spotlight, or at least most of the time. And patients are always asking me, if there's one supplement that I can start on right here, right now, if I suspect I have mold, what would it be? And they're always very surprised when I give them this answer, but it's usually the colloidal silver nasal spray that we carry here, which I think is actually our cheapest supplement. I think it's like $20. And so, whether it's a patient that I'm working with, or if they got family members like kids, husband, stuff like that, and they want to see what else they can do for them right now, I usually will start them all on this nasal spray, because the primary way that mold finds its way into your body is when you're breathing it in, it actually goes into your nose. And these fungal spores can actually colonize in there. And a lot of ENT doctors have actually observed that a lot of patients that have chronic sinusitis, inflammation of the sinus cavities, it's usually because they have fungal sinusitis. And it's a big problem, because a lot of times these people that have this reoccurring sinusitis issue usually go and they get a prescription to treat more of a bacterial problem, not so much a fungal issue. And if you read up on here, according to the Cleveland Clinic, if fungal sinusitis goes unresolved for a long enough time, it could lead to something more serious like death. But mold, yeast, all these things can definitely cause that. And so from clinical experience, the fastest results that I've seen with patients healing from mold is when they're all on this nasal spray. In fact, I had a lady come in one time who moved out of an old water damaged barn, and she was out of the source for a few months, and she was still having all these issues. And so I suspected she had mold, and I just said, all right, I need you to go do these 3 labs. The results are going to come in a month. While we're waiting for the results to come in, I want you to start taking this nasal spray. Well, she came back a few weeks later, and she showed me a before and after photo of her face, and it completely shrunk. All that swelling in her face completely came down. She actually looked like a very different person because of that. So it played a large role in her healing journey. Now, other things that I usually work on with patients that have mold toxicity as far as supplementation goes, antimicrobials is a big one, because again, they usually have a lot of infections in the body. And so it's nice to start giving them a lot of those antimicrobials. If they got fungal problems like mold, it's nice to rotate some of these antimicrobials around, because they can become resistant over time to things that you try to kill it with. So this is a big issue that a lot of people that try to do it themselves miss, is that they might stay on an antimicrobial that's natural for a very long time. And then the fungus will become resistant to it, and then it will just laugh at you. And so Got to switch some things around. Biofilm busters is a big one because, again, you want to break up that biofilm so you have a higher likelihood of getting rid of these infections from the body. Binders, because mycotoxins are just sitting in your tissues and you need to take some type of a binder to extract these toxins out of the body, bind them up so you can get them out of the system. Liver and gallbladder support, again, bile secretion is a huge proponent to allowing your body to poop these toxins out of the body. And if the liver and the gallbladder are not working very well, you're going to run into some serious problems. In fact, when people get their gallbladders removed due to gallstones, a large reason why that can occur is because the amount of mycotoxins that they're getting exposed to is just murdering that gallbladder. And over time, it's starting to oxidize and create inflammation in there, and you're starting to get these crystals form, which we call gallstones. And so it's not the only reason why that can happen, but it is one thing that I've seen commonly. And unfortunately, those people that don't have a gallbladder anymore, they're going to need some extra support, whether they like it or not, if they're dealing with a mold problem, because they just naturally are going to have trouble eliminating those toxins from their body now. Antioxidants is a big one. Again, in the research out there, you'll see that mycotoxins create a lot of oxidative stress to the body. And so it's very important to get some antioxidant support to start repairing this damaged tissue in the body. Immune system support. And so again, like I said before, mycotoxins are very suppressive to the immune system. And you'd be hard pressed to find somebody out there that has adequate vitamin D levels when they're suffering with mold toxicity. I have never personally seen somebody that came in that had normal vitamin D levels that I tested unless they were already supplementing with vitamin D. And so aside from the nasal spray, that would probably be another one that I would tell everyone to start taking. I always make sure that it's vitamin D3 with K2 to make it more safe and bioavailable. But it plays a huge role in a lot of different processes in the body. And that's a common one that I observe with patients with mold. Then finally is your nutrient support. And so again, you're going to get depleted of a lot of different nutrients in your body as your body's trying to allocate resources to put out this fire in your body with mold. And so there's going to be a lot of nutritional deficiencies that need to be resolved. One of them in particular, because the kidneys are getting damaged and people are urinating more frequently, they're going to drain their potassium levels very quickly. And your body needs like 4,700 milligrams of potassium daily to get the adequate amount. That's according to the RDA recommendations. And so that would be always one thing that people really need to pay close attention to if they're suffering with mold and they're having this frequent urination, is how fast are they depleting their potassium levels? Because then people are going to start having heart palpitations, dizziness. They can start having anxiousness, numbness, muscle fatigue, cramps, joint pain. I mean, just a lot of things are going to start to happen. Weight gain, I could go on and on and on about that. Now, other things that are really helpful for working with mycotoxins. So infrared saunas are really helpful. So when you look at a sauna, an infrared sauna is very different than a steam sauna. When you go into those steam saunas, they're only extracting about 3 to 10% of the toxins in your sweat. And a lot of those steam saunas tend to breed a lot of mold in them because they're wooden. So I don't recommend going into a steam sauna for those two reasons. If you're using an infrared sauna, what's nice about it is that it goes deeper into the tissue, and so it can extract more toxins. And so, I mean, they've observed that in the sweat of people that use infrared saunas, ochratoxin, one of those popular mycotoxins, has showed up in the sweat, and about 20 to 30% of that sweat can actually contain toxins, which I know sounds gross, but it's a very effective way for getting it out of the body. If people can't afford these personal infrared saunas, there is little sauna blankets that almost look like little snuggies you can wrap yourself in, and they're infrared saunas, and it's a lot more cost-effective strategy. I have seen good results with patients using those. Blood ozone IV therapy is another option. I believe here at the Green Bay, one of our nurse practitioners has that technology now, or is at least planning on getting it. The only thing about the ozone IV therapy is you got to be very careful, and this is why it's very important to be working with a mold literate doctor, because I've had patients go rogue and decide to go get an IV treatment like this, and their body ends up going through what's called a Herxheimer reaction. So what's a Herxheimer reaction? It's basically the fancy term for a detox effect. And basically what can happen is when you get these toxins out of your body, they have to go through your bloodstream in order to find their way out of your body. And if they sit in your bloodstream long enough, they can make you feel like crap. This is actually a large reason why if any patients on here are patients of the Wellness Way and you started taking your supplements and you might feel like crap for a while, like extra brain fog, fatigue, changes in your bowel movements, menstrual cycles, skin rashes, etc., it largely could be because your body is eliminating toxins from your body. It's not just mold that does it. Candida does it, parasites, bacteria, heavy metals, no matter what. When these things exit your you're probably going to see some weird negative symptoms for a while. And it's literally probably the #1 email that I get from patients, even though I'll tell them day one, people can only accumulate so much information on these talks. And so it can go in one ear and out the other ear. But a couple of other things too, it's very important, again, to be working with these mold literate doctors, because my job is to make it so that this potential detox effect isn't so much that the patient can't carry out care, right? Because I have had it in the past where maybe a patient takes some of this stuff, even though I warned them, their detox symptoms are way more than they can tolerate, and then they feel discouraged and leave. And we don't want that, obviously. If people have to take a baby dose of a baby dose and do baby steps with their care, that's totally fine. You're going to see that a ton with mold patients. They're very sensitive. And so, again, I just want to make a huge point in talking about this, because this is probably, aside from people figuring out where this mold's coming from, that can make it a challenge for them healing from mold, this detox effect is also a very crucial topic that can make it a very tricky thing with people trying to heal from mold. Just think of it like, if anyone 21 and older has ever gone through a hangover, right? If you drink too much poison, aka alcohol, the next day you're exhausting all your detox pathways, right? Your breath might smell like beer, your poop might smell like beer, your sweat, urine. And if you can't get all those toxins out of your body, the longer it's sitting in your system, you might start feeling like crap, nausea, vomiting, anxiousness, you name it. So again, be wary of a potential detox effect. Now, before I dive into my last 10%, I do want to shift gears again over to these guys, because they're going to announce the winner of today's giveaway.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Thanks for interacting with us on all platforms today. You guys were awesome. So on Instagram today, we have 10 winners. First one is inhisglory.amandajustine. Second one is Chris Slap 2012, Emily Quiz, Noor Jahamino, C. Weiss 36, Blue Eyed Gidget, Barrow Crew, Maria.Canzanori.3, Daniel Z. Heath 4, and Karen Gabby 08. Congratulations, guys. What do you guys have?
The Instagram names are always wild.
Yeah, the Instagram.
That's it.
So I was on the ADP website with you guys. Thanks for interacting. You guys had a lot of really good questions. Our winners today are Christy M., Ruby Mast, Sierra Rose, Ida Mendel, Jess J., Dawn Hesprich, Connie Lacey, Paula Vandenheuvel, Tim Sturzinger, and Markel Berger. Congrats, guys.
Beautiful. I was over on Facebook, and we got 10 winners here too. So Colette Brooks, Sandra Laverne, Paula Martin, William Gallagher, Rose Fabsitz, Kathy Claver, Rhonda Mako, Jacqueline McName Askew, Kimmy Heil, and then HeidiKnuckles@gmail.com. So that email that you guys are seeing on the screen, don't forget the little S there before the @sign, because then we will never know that you are reaching out to us. But claim your herbal throat spray. And this is a great one to pair along with today's training too, because that oral cavity is highly tied in with things like bacteria, mold, and all the rest. So, but we got a last 10% to cover as well. So Dr. Alex, take it away.
All right, guys. So we know that there is a huge event that's coming up in the next few days, okay? And I do want to say that the Wellness Way has some big things that are coming pretty soon here. Dr. Patrick, who's the founder of the Wellness Way, he's got a lot of connections now as this platform is growing. And he's, as you can see up on the screen, I mean, he's had Robert F. Kennedy on his ADP podcast in the past. And he's also got a close relationship with some of his other close contacts. And then the same thing applies to Del Bigtree, which you're seeing in the other photo, who's the host of the popular show, The Live Wire. And so, again, there's this growing movement to make America healthy again. And he's been working tirelessly with a lot of these individuals because we're gearing up for this upcoming election. Now, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for, obviously, right? It's clear and indicative where a lot of us may sit on this side of the aisle. But again, we are starting to gain a lot of traction. And if we really do get a certain amount of people in the White House that can really start to change the shape of Western medicine, they're going to be looking for a group of people that are really best suited to help the general population. And we're really hoping to lead to better access for natural health care for individuals. That includes potentially maybe insurance being able to cover more things. Who knows, right? The possibilities are endless. All I can tell you is that right now we have a beautiful coalition right now that's bipartisan. We've got lifeline Democrats like the Kennedy family partying up with Donald Trump right now to make this event happen. And so, again, your voice is something that matters. I would treat this thing like it is a neck and neck race, and it is going to be decided by one vote. When you look at Wellness Way, we're always going to support people who support freedom. You know, if you look me, I'm getting a little emotional, but I am a veteran that has served in the Army for at least 6 years. I just recently got out a few months ago. I was with the Corps of Engineers. One of the best things that they train you out there is just to not run away from a fight, right? So that's always been my mindset. Every time I'm going into this natural sphere as a doctor now, my mindset's still that I'm going to war. You know, it's with the powers that be that are running this Western medicine approach that we have right now. If you want to see that change, then you got to make it happen. You know, I believe that God called on me to start doing my due diligence as a healthcare provider now and helping all these people. And if I feel like I have to be going against the wind with the general public and the general thinking sphere for healthcare, then so be it, right? Because I do feel like that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing here on this planet. Now, the last thing I'll leave you guys with is my references. So these are all really good, informative pieces to go grab more information pertaining to mold. And so up at the top, you can see that Dr. Klinghardt EMF study that I had talked about. If you go to drkrista.com, again, she is the naturopath. That's the world-renowned doc for working with mold. She has a lot of good handouts and information regarding that subject on her website. Yes, We Inspect are the people that inspect for mold. They can go to pretty much every spot in the U.S. They will fly somebody out there if they have to. So don't think that you have to live in California to have access to them. So if you want to at least pick their brain about remediatorial steps or inspection steps, I would contact them. Neil Nathan, again, he's the MD that's been working on mold for 30 years. He's got a great website with more great handouts and information pertaining to mold. There is a functional medicine provider named Evan Brand who has a very popular podcast on Spotify, The Evan Brand Show. He's got a lot of good clinical pearls about mold. If you go to survivingmold.com, that is where Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who is a pioneer for bringing mold to the limelight, he's got a lot of good protocols. I will personally say that a lot of his stuff are more outdated now as technology has advanced with being able to test for mold, but there's still some useful information there. And then finally, the We Inspect company has a podcast called Mold Finders Radio, where they talk about remediation, inspection, things of that nature, where that can also have some really good information for the general public. So again, guys, I appreciate all of you guys having me on to talk about mold with you guys. It's a very big topic. There is so much information coming out, and I feel like it's catching like wildfire on the internet right now with all these other mainstream healthcare providers out there talking about it. But my goal is to make sure that our reach can expand more with a lot of our docs so that we have the best trained docs to help with a subject like this, because it is an ongoing health epidemic and a lot of people are suffering and need answers. So again, thank you guys and have a great rest of your Saturday. Dr. Alex signing off.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single video or live stream. Each week on A Different Perspective, we bring you the most cutting edge information on health you won't find anywhere else. For more information on this topic, please visit our website. A Different Perspective offers life-changing information and resources to share and explore. A Different Perspective is leading a health revolution.